setting a boundary with someone, we like to think, oh, I just set this expectation and now there's this awesome, thing in place and they're never going to overstep my boundary. No, setting the boundary is actually making a commitment to yourself that if they try to overstep the boundary, you will take an action. Ever work for a manager who expects you to be Superman? No matter how much you do, they always seem to ask for more. Well, back when I worked as a software consultant for over 20 different companies, unfortunately, I ran into people like this often. At first, I thought, hey, it's their fault. But eventually I realized it was actually up to me to let them know when they'd gone too far. In this episode, I'll share how I learned to set healthy boundaries with your manager. This can really help you avoid burnout and be looked at much more professionally, which is a little bit counterintuitive. Nobody likes a doormat. And if you let people walk all over you, including your manager, they can lose respect for you. So let's talk about how you can set healthy boundaries with your manager. The first thing to consider is, have you agreed on the responsibilities of your job role? Back when you took your job, if you're an employee, you probably had some sort of job description when you applied, and that listed the roles and responsibilities of the position. But it's pretty common that when you've been at a company for a little while, those responsibilities can shift. And if they shift too much and you don't have it in writing, now you're kind of in a slippery situation where your manager can begin to ask you to do the work of 3 different people. And if you don't actually have an agreement on what is within your responsibilities and isn't, suddenly you start burning out, you start working overtime, you start getting in arguments with your manager. And it could actually not be just your manager's fault. It's actually your fault for not catching the fact that so much has been piled onto you that it's time to maybe reset expectations, meet with them and say, hey, it seems like my job has evolved since we worked, originally when I got this job. What can we do to define what my job looks like now? Here's a recommendation, and sort of, you can write basically an updated job description for them. Here's the stuff that you're having me do now that I think you're expecting of me, here, and don't include the things that you don't want to be doing, or you can even be explicit about those. The second thing you can do to set healthy boundaries with your manager, or you need to do rather, is to determine what unacceptable expectations are. What I mean by this is go back, in the past of your career, or maybe your current gig you're working now, and think about times your manager or a past manager or a past, coworker has asked you to do something that you felt was just unacceptable. Maybe they asked you to work 80 hours a week for some release. Maybe they asked you to stay really late, when you already had plans and that was unacceptable to you. Maybe they asked you to take a promotion when you said you didn't actually want the promotion. You wanted to continue to be, let's say, an individual contributor. You're happy with where you are. Whatever it is, and there's an endless number of these, so I'm not trying to kind of constrain your list by what I'm talking about here. But first of all, you just have to determine, what are some boundaries to set? What are some things that they could overstep in the first place before you can set those with your manager? Next, you need to assign consequences. What's going to happen if your boundaries are overstepped? I think a lot of people who are newer to setting boundaries in relationships, whether it's your manager or your spouse or your children, whoever, they kind of look at boundaries as, oh, it's this rule that I'm setting for myself. And if I get pissed off enough, then I'm going to yell at the other person that, hey, you overstepped my boundaries. Well, you need to let them know what they are. And I'm going to talk about that in the next point. But the bigger thing is you need to actually know, what am I going to do if my boundaries are overstepped. If I'm asked to work 80 hours a week and I say, hey, we had an agreement before, that's unacceptable to me, and you're attempted to be pushed into that, you need to determine what are the consequences to your manager. Does that mean you're going to quit? The first time that you get your expectations pushed to violate a boundary that you've set is the time to enforce that boundary with the person that you've set that expectation with. And if you don't do it the first time, then they will just look at it like, well, hey, last time, you said you had this boundary and I, you went over it. So why should you this time? It doesn't seem like it's that important. But you'll have to brainstorm a little bit. You can get creative about it, but you need to think, if I'm asked to take a promotion that I don't want to and I'm pushed into it, what is that going to mean? Am I going to have a talk with my boss's boss? Am I going to request to get transferred to a different department? Am I going to take this other job offer that I've been considering? It could be any number of things, but you got to figure out not only what are the boundaries you're setting, what's the unacceptable behavior that somebody might expect of you or ask you to do, what are the consequences? And this is often the hardest part of this, but the fourth step here is you need to actually communicate your boundaries. Now, I would say in a professional setting, this is just my opinion, using the word boundaries is probably not smart or just not the best idea. When you say boundaries to your manager, it's going to come off a little bit confrontational. But what you do want to do is you want to communicate what your expectations are. Again, expecting that certain unacceptable behaviors aren't going to be asked of you, and then what the consequences are going to be if those expectations are violated. Now, this can be a difficult conversation, but if you're successful with it, you can move forward with your job with a lot less stress. Now, you could communicate that to your manager just by saying, hey, I wanted to meet with you. Let's say you set up a one-on-one with them. You do it over Zoom, hopefully in person. That's way better. And you say, hey, I've been here for a while. One of the things I'd really like to do is make sure that I help you be successful by having our expectations be really clear on, what I'm expecting of you and you're expecting of me. I've been looking at the way that we've been working, and one of the things that might help is for you to just know that I kind of have a personal rule that I'm never going to work over 50 hours a week. I did that in the past, and it led to problems with my mental health. My wife got upset. I couldn't, be there for my kids, whatever it is, whatever your reasoning is. And it doesn't have to make sense to them. It's only for you. You don't have to explain yourself necessarily. But just so you know, if I'm asked to work over 50 hours, that's not something I'm going to be comfortable with here. And now you're not saying when that happens, you're going to quit. You don't have to necessarily communicate that, but you have to say that it's not acceptable. Now, the manager may say, well, what's going to happen if I ask you to work 60 hours? And that's where you got to go, well, I'm just not going to do it. It's a boundary that I've set. And that's where you may have to say that it's a boundary. Hopefully that you're not pushed into that. But it's a little bit of a negotiation. Now, they may want, well, what about 55 hours? And what about if it's only once a quarter? And you can decide how much you want to flex. But you got to come to an agreement on that so that if something happens and they do try to push you to violate your boundaries, you can basically do the next step. And that's step 5. Have a backup plan. Decide in advance, what are you going to do if your boundary is violated? If you're requested to work overtime that you've already got an agreement from your manager isn't acceptable. If you've been asked to do some release on the weekend that you already agreed with your manager, you aren't going to do that. And they push you to do it. And you have to now enforce the boundary. Here's the thing that I think I didn't really understand originally until I really learned about boundaries about 12 years, 15 years into my own career. Setting a boundary with someone, we like to think, oh, I just set this expectation and now there's this awesome, thing in place and they're never going to overstep my boundary. No, setting the boundary is actually making a commitment to yourself that if they try to overstep the boundary, you will take an action. I know this is hard, but this is where you have to really have integrity and stand up for yourself. If you can't do this, then you can't really complain that the company's treating you crappy or your manager isn't respecting your boundaries. Again, your manager won't respect boundaries you haven't stated. And if they don't respect them, it's up to you to enforce the boundary. And the way that you enforce the boundary is by having a backup plan when they have to deal with the consequences. For example, you're now going to quit because they've asked you to work overtime more times than told them was acceptable. Well, now you've got consequences to deal with. So having some sort of backup plan in place, other offers in place, temporary consulting gigs, 6 months of savings in an emergency fund, whatever that looks like to you, if you don't have some sort of backup plan in place, then when that moment comes where they're asking you, hey, I want you to do this thing where you've already got an agreement that it's a boundary, you will basically have a really hard time sticking up for yourself. And if you don't do this, the problem is the moment that you overstep your boundaries, you compromise on what you've already agreed with your manager you're not going to do, they're going to lose respect for you. They're also going to expect from now on that they're going to do it again. So I know this is way easier said than done, especially in today's market where it really feels like the employers have all the power. But remember, if you don't actually try doing this stuff, then you really can't blame the company 100% because you had an opportunity to at least try to set healthy boundaries with your employer and you didn't even try. And hey, if you had a really hard time setting boundaries, or you've been in situations in the past where you've had your boundaries overstepped and either you didn't communicate them clearly or you burned out because you basically went against what you felt was a boundary in the first place, I want to encourage you to consider joining the Patreon membership for this channel or the YouTube membership, which you can join right here. It gives you access to a Discord server. There's about over 100 people, I think, in there now. And this includes past coaching clients of mine, current coaching clients of mine, people who've bought my course, and obviously members. These are some of the best people that I've met that are really into a lot of the stuff we talk about here on the channel. So if you're looking at having a healthy, thriving career in software, and it doesn't matter if you're a developer, product manager, engineering manager, you're a data scientist, you're in UX, any of these roles that are related to delivering software. If you're feeling a little bit alone, if you're feeling a little stressed out, or you just want to have some people that you can talk to kind of get off your chest what's going on, get some support, here's some additional strategies. Obviously, I'm in there too. There's a link in the description. Check it out. We'd love to have you join us. And if you're at that point where you need more than, chat-based support, I think you know this by now, I offer tech career coaching. There's also a link in the description. You can apply for that as well. So have you ever felt powerless with your management? Did you clearly articulate what your expected behavior from them is and what the consequences are going to be if they violate it? Have you ever had to enforce a boundary and had difficult circumstances? Have you ever compromised on enforcing a boundary? Let me know about it in the comments. Until next time, thanks.